Hi, I'm Lesbianis Joanna, a teacher at the parish of St. Stylianos in Gaimea. I want you to imagine you're on a ship at night in the middle of a storm. The conditions are disastrous. Waves crash against the ship, the rain is pouring down, there's a strong wind, thunder, lightning. Some people are rushing around, calling out and screaming. Others are silent. Everyone feels hopeless. And then, one man finds a radio. He hears and communicates to all the message that help is coming. The storm is nearly over. A rescue ship is on its way. You'll recognize it by a flashing red light in the distance. The storm continues, but now there's hope. You know what you're looking for to be saved. Our lives are very much like this ship. We are trying to get through the sea of life, and when bombarded with the waves of sin and the winds of temptation, trying to destroy us and lead us in the wrong direction. Humanity has always been in the same boat. In the many years before Christ, as told in the Old Testament, the Israelites, although they believed in God, often struggled and were journeying through their own storm. And yet they remained hopeful. They knew that the Messiah, like the rescue ship, was coming to save them. How did they know this? Because they had radio receivers, people who would receive messages of hope from heaven. These were the prophets, who prophesied about the coming of Christ. How many prophets can you think of? Well, there were many prophets in the Old Testament. Moses, Elijah, Samuel, Nathan, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, and John the Baptist, who was the last of the prophets. The prophets, chosen and enlightened by God, were God's messengers. They proclaimed the will of God to the people before the time of Christ, and they foretold the coming of the long-awaited Messiah. They were God's mouthpiece. God sent his prophets to lead his people home. The prophets foretold that God would intervene in the world to bring salvation and joy, that he would establish one day a blessed kingdom for his people. They talked of a man who would come to save God's people, the Messiah, who was Christ. They prophesied the events of Christ's life, his works, and his death. The prophets were sent by God to prepare the Jews, and through them all of mankind, for the coming of the Saviour of the world, so that when he came, he would be recognized and mankind would believe in him. In the books of the Old Testament, several hundred prophecies about the Messiah and the kingdom he would establish can be found. They are scattered throughout almost all the books of the Old Testament, beginning with the 5 books of Moses and ending with the last Old Testament prophets, Zechariah and Malachi. Let me give you some examples. Think about the nativity of Christ. So when Jesus was born, the wise men travelled from the east to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews?" Now Herod was troubled. He gathered all the chief priests and scribes together and asked them where Christ was to be born. So they said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea." How did they know this? Because they had studied the books of the prophets. The prophet Micah, who lived 700 years before Christ, said in his prophecy, "But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." The prophet Isaiah foretold that the Messiah would be born of a virgin. King David prophesied that foreign kings would bring gifts to the Messiah, these kings being the wise men. The prophet Jeremiah foretold that the Messiah would be a descendant of King David. Now, we all know the story of Moses, who led the Israelites out of Egypt and received the 10 Commandments. Did you also know that Moses prophesied the coming of Christ? He said, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst, from your brethren. Him you shall hear." He said that God would give them a prophet who would be like him. He would be the lawgiver, who would give them a new law. He would be the mediator between God and his people. He would be their leader and saviour from the tyranny of evil, and that the people must obey him. After Moses, many other prophets came, but none fulfilled the expectations of the Jews. They continued to wait for the prophet, the new Moses, the Messiah. And then Jesus came. He gave them the perfect law and saved them and all people from the slavery of sin and death. Even Christ's crucifixion and death were prophesied. The suffering that Christ endured, the ridicule, the scourgings were prophesied. The fact that Christ endured all these things with patience and in silence was prophesied. 800 years before all of this happened, the prophet Isaiah foretold the sufferings of Christ. In Isaiah 53, we read the following lines. "He was despised and rejected by men. He was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter. He was numbered with the transgressors, yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors." So why is it important that we know this? Well, these prophecies are all evidence that Jesus was not just a great man, but he was sent by God to be our Saviour. He was the Messiah, the leader, the Son of the living God. He fulfilled the prophecies. And that is why Philip, when he first met the Lord, ran excitedly to his friend Nathanael and told him with joy, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." The fact that these prophets were able to speak about the future with such accuracy and detail, hundreds of years in advance, shows how God spoke through them. These prophecies show God's power, that show that God had a plan for his people and he fulfilled that plan. And this should give us hope, that God also has a plan for us. How can we be afraid? How can we have doubts? We should trust and hope in God, knowing that he will lead us through this journey and that he will not leave us shipwrecked.